Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of FIBAC's virtual book talk series. I hope everyone's well today, which here in Worcester, it is a very rainy day. I hope it's sunny and beautiful where you are. I am Kevin Wisniewski. I'm the Director of Book History and Digital Initiatives at the American Antiquarian Society. And today's guest is Amy Hildreth Chen, who will discuss her new book, Placing Papers: The American Literary Archives Market. Before I invite Amy to join me here, I'd like to welcome both newcomers and returning viewers alike. The American Antiquarian Society was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas, and we are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. Today's event is part of the program in the history of the book in American culture, or FIBAC, and it is part of a series of monthly book talks dedicated to book history. Each month, we will invite an author of a recently published monograph or digital equivalent to share that work, and at the end to answer a few questions from those in attendance. For those tweeting today, you are welcome and encouraged to use a couple of hashtags. We have the hashtag FIBAC, that's PHBAC, and hashtag Placing Papers, which you'll notice on the screen beside me. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a quick overview on the platform here, although I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with it at this point. We are currently using Zoom Webinar, and there are two big functions that I'd like to highlight today. So first, at the bottom of the menu bar, you will see the chat function. This is where we will share some helpful links. You'll see in a moment they are being added by my friend and colleague Amanda Kondik at AAS. We will share some helpful links that will include Placing Papers publisher page, Amy's website, and a few helpful links to the AAS website regarding future programs and later a mailing list if you're interested in learning more about FIBAC and some of the upcoming programs we have in store for you. Second, you'll notice the Q&A function. In the Q&A function, you may ask your questions there. I would recommend that you don't wait till the end of the talk to submit a question and instead submit as something comes to mind. You'll also notice that there is a feature where attendees can vote questions up. So if someone else has the same or a similar question to you, rather than repeat that question, we can move that up the list. And at the end of Amy's talk, I will moderate that list and get to as many as we possibly can today. Finally, I'd like to let everyone know that this event is being recorded. For those who could not attend today, the video will be available on the Society's YouTube channel. And I will also send an email in the next 2 weeks or so when that video is available to all of you. So thank you very much. If you like what you see here today, as always, I encourage you to sign up for our mailing list. It is quick and free, and it is the best way to make sure that you don't miss out on future programs. The link is available in the chat, or will be in a moment, and we will make that available at the end of today's talk as well. So I look forward to seeing you all come back. Thank you. With that, I would like to introduce today's guest. So Amy, if you'd please join me. Dr. Amy Hildreth Chen is an independent scholar from North Liberty, Iowa, and she is the author of Placing Papers: The American Literary Archives Market. She previously worked as an academic librarian at the University of Iowa and the University of Alabama, and she obtained her PhD in English from Emory University in 2013. Today we will be talking about her first book, Placing Papers, which was published earlier this year by the University of Massachusetts Press. So it is my pleasure today to welcome Amy Chen. Thank you, Amy. Oh, I'm sorry, Amy. Got it.
Oh, Zoom.
Thank you, Amy.
Hey, everyone. Oh, COVID-19. Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for taking time to listen to this talk. And as always, I invite you to reach out to me if you're on Twitter. I'm happy to continue the conversation at any time. So I look forward to hearing from you. So I'm Amy Hildreth Chen, the author of Placing Papers, The American Literary Archive Market, which is out now through the University of Massachusetts Press. Today I'll be discussing portions of my book in this talk, The Origins of the American Literary Archive Market, which will primarily focus on the 19th century. Please feel free to tweet about this presentation or the book, either now or later. Just use hashtag Placing Papers and my handle at Amy Hildreth Chen. All right. So let's start with a background to the book's topic. Following World War II, the first universities that recognized the teaching and research potential of contemporary writers' papers ignored naysayers who saw these writers as well as their materials as less prestigious subjects for study. A growing number of students entered American higher education after Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, more commonly known as the GI Bill, in 1944, which swelled the size of younger universities. These new students then enrolled in graduate school, eventually completing more dissertations on the topic of American literature between 1948 and 1961 than between 1891 and 1948. University libraries acquiring materials of contemporary writers could provide these students with more affordable sources for their research than the cost of building significant holdings in early modern books or medieval manuscripts. Even though traditionalists in English departments discouraged their graduate students from studying early 20th century authors, C.S. Lewis famously derided the practice by saying, "The student who wants a tutor's assistance in reading the works of his own contemporaries might as well ask for nurse's assistance in blowing his own nose." Despite this, contemporary literary studies caught on. Yet delivering literary papers to graduate students wasn't easy. It happened thanks to a series of legal shifts which began in both the United States and the United Kingdom in the 19th century. One shift created the profession of literary agents. Another generated strong intellectual property rights. Together, these developments allowed writers to defend their published work, sell it for better prices, and ultimately monetize their diaries, drafts, letters, and more. All the things we take for granted now when we look through a contemporary literary archive. We'll cover these two topics, and then we'll devote the final portion of this talk to a critical eye as to why we find these original documents so valuable in the first place. Literary agents. Literary agents became a profession in England during the late 1800s when shifts in law and technology began to hurt authors' ability to make a living. Steam printing in the 1840s, the abolition of the newspaper penny tax in 1855, the elimination of the paper duty in 1861, and the invention of linotype machines in 1886 radically increased the number of available publications. As competition increased, publishers began to experience revenue losses and needed to find a way to retain their profit. And what worked best was paying authors less. Now, authors wanted to better represent their interests. They knew what was happening. So they created professional associations to address the problem. A crop of organizations dedicated to authors' rights appeared in England throughout the late 19th century, including the Guild of Literature and Art in 1851, the Association to Protect the Rights of Authors in 1875, the Society of Authors in 1884, and the Authors Syndicate in 1890. But authors were not experienced negotiators, and they lacked knowledge of the publishing environment. Even working together, writers could not bridge the gap between their trade and their new responsibilities, which was defending their intellectual property. So the era's authors turned to literary agents. A.M. Burrs A.P. Wyatt and Curtis Brown, which is who's on the screen right now, were the first literary agents. But Burrs defrauded his clients. Watt and Brown, however, had more character and became successful in a new profession that required them to be 1/3 lawyer, 1/3 editor, and 1/3 schmoozer, with a little bit of psychologist thrown in. Watt would go on to represent author Conan Doyle, Thomas Hardy, and Rudyard Kipling. Brown became the most famous of the three. As an American who had moved to England, Brown's ability to negotiate caused the English publisher Frederick Macmillan to describe him as a most objectionable man who emanates, I'm afraid, from your side of the Atlantic. Another publisher, Henry Holt, expanded on the complaint to the whole profession, describing all agents as contemptible interlopers and pests. These complaints arose because previous business conventions benefited the publisher. Agents forced the power dynamics to become more equitable. Instead of admitting that agents threaten their bottom line by advocating on the behalf of writers to increase their prices, publishers focused their attention on the behavior of agents and criticized them for acting in an ungentlemanly manner. Revealing that literature was a commodity just like any other violated the discursive norms of publishing, a mindset that sociologists would later describe as a habitus that required treating literature as if its profit margin did not matter. Agents dispersed with this protocol by buying and selling copyrights, much as a cotton broker bought and sold cotton, which is the painting you see in front of you. As agents saw copyright as a good, they were not inclined to indulge in polite behaviors suggesting that publishing literature was anything more than just another business. So that's a bit about how literary agents got started as a profession. Now we're going to move into what their business was, which is protecting intellectual property rights. IP originated in the 19th century, and this next discussion will constrain itself to the development of American intellectual property, IP. Intellectual property rights in the United States are quite strong today, and historical accounts point out that the twist in priorities that occurred when the US transformed itself first from an agricultural to a manufacturing nation, and then from a manufacturing hub to a country with an information economy. Each shift from agriculture to manufacturing and then manufacturing to information economy, each of those shifts strengthens the enforcement of intellectual property rights. In the 19th century, as many of you know, the US weakly applied intellectual property rights because the country had less innovation to protect. As the United States industrialized, enforcing these rights became more critical to support economic growth. Such rights remained just as valuable when the United States transitioned to an information and service-based economy, aided in part by the digital revolution at the end of the 20th century. Economic motives made intellectual property a value worth legally protecting over time. So American property protections grew. Okay, back to where we were supposed to be. American copyright protections grew from the precedent of legal opinions. Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis enumerated American privacy rights in 1890. Warren and Brandeis weighed examples from the United States, the United Kingdom, and France to recognize that privacy extends to both person and property, but while personal privacy remained a stable category over time, conceptions of property rights shifted. Tangible and intangible property became equally weighed. Warren and Brandeis specifically named the products and processes of the mind as literature and art as among one's intangible possessions. So this is critical. So when so-called yellow journalists who entertained their readers with lurid tales and photographs at the turn of the century provoked Warren and Brandeis to write their opinion. In it, Warren and Brandeis decried not only the use of cameras to peer into private domiciles, which is something, of course, that's becoming even more important nowadays, but also the ways in which written content could be employed for salacious ends. For example, although a letter could be reprinted in full to a newspaper to make a slanderous point, quotation was not necessary. A description of a letter alone could make a similar conclusion. As a result, they decided that the right to protect one's privacy arose from an individual's innate right to be left alone. Additionally, they did not find a distinction between works created in response to professional or artistic interests and those that were created due to the course of a regular life. Warren and Brandeis did not consider how privacy rights could be applied to literary archives. Their fourth provision, which summarizes that the right of privacy ceases upon publication of the facts by the individual or with his or her consent, contains the language that is of most relevance to later legal cases of the rights of authors and their estates. Even though writers tried to retain their privacy in the face of scholarly and public interest, even if they achieve successful protections in the short term, in the long term, their collections will become open. Future audiences will interpret content according to their own perception from their own time. So recent legal disputes, such as those between Carol Schloss, who is pictured right now, and the James Joyce estate, show that some authors have not fully grasped the repercussions of the decision to place their papers on the literary archives market. And maybe to be more fair, I should say some authors and their families do not fully appreciate what does it mean to go on the literary archives market. It's easy to think that you can sell papers and retain your rights, but of course that puts you at a conflict of interest with universities and the researchers that they represent. And so here we have a summary of what happened in the case of Joyce and Carol Schloss. You can read this at your own leisure from the Center of Internet and Society. But this is a very significant case because of the long-term impacts that the Joyce estate has had on dampening the scholarship around James Joyce. So it's a particularly good one to look into, but there's many more examples in my book. So please feel free to give that a peruse. So writers believe that they are merely putting their works on display without recognizing that they have sold themselves on the market. Writers who use their intellectual property rights to protect themselves prove what University of Wisconsin-Madison Associate Professor Derek Johnson and his colleague Professor Jonathan Gray say, that authorship is about control, power, and the management of meaning and people just as much as it is about creativity and innovation. After all, placing papers to a repository open to the public would seem to support the concept that consent has been provided formally. After all, the papers have changed hands. They've changed ownership officially. However, Warren and Brandeis's emphasis on protecting both the papers of work and life has had residual effects on how the law could be imagined, articulated, and applied through intellectual property rights over the next 100 years. The result is that authors and their families are more empowered than scholars, often with heartbreaking results, at least from my perspective as a scholar, for those who study these literary giants in good faith, which not everyone does, but I would like to say most of us do. So why do we want to study authors by looking at their papers in the first place? Why isn't just reading their work enough? After all, the desire for more intimate access is what got us into the hot seat in the first place. Like intellectual property rights, our desire to interact with drafts and diaries and other detritus of an author's ambition also has its roots in the 19th century and even earlier. So let's consider how Dana Gioia, the chairperson for the National Endowment of the Arts from 2003 and 2008, and poet laureate of California from 2015 to 2018, describes viewing literary manuscripts. In his widely recirculated article on the power of manuscripts, they hand to the poet, Gioia quotes Walt Whitman, who touches this, touches a man, before pondering why the collection of literary manuscripts is rarely considered as a topic for critical inquiry. Thousands of librarians, curators, dealers, and scholars, as well as numerous private collectors, are currently building huge archives of primary materials. No other culture in history has even approached the level of activity that is now routine in America. Our institutions spend vast sums to acquire and house manuscript materials. Without fully articulating why, the culture has agreed that even in an era of shrinking resources, collecting and preserving literary manuscripts is a priority. Gioia then poses a question. Why does American culture engage in such systematic financial investment in a field that has thought so little about it? He finds his answers in the physical body of the author, which gives literary manuscripts what he calls their magical or intangible value. The magical value is what attracts scholars to study a manuscript. A document's meaningful value is what scholars do with that manuscript. A manuscript's magical value is also what makes it a fetish. Even though the word fetish occurs only once in the hand of the poet, when he calls literary manuscripts' ability to create a direct and unmediated physical link between the viewer and the author, like a holy relic or shamanistic fetish, Gioia uses language that closely parallels how fetishes are described. What matters in that a literary archive is an expansion of the writer's body, not just his or her mind. And to put a fine point on this, the slide I'm showing right now shows how a literary archive can actually become body and mind at once. And so this is a particularly tragic example, but there's many more examples out there of archives that make gestures to the human body in ways beyond the use of handwriting, which is something that many scholars have discussed in the past. So the scholarly discussion defining fetishism and its presence in contemporary culture is extensive. Most theorists begin their analysis with Karl Marx's definition. Marx described fetishism as a secret, explaining how objects take on fetishistic qualities when they are transformed from an extremely obvious, trivial thing to items that abound in physical and metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. The metaphysical and theological aura that Marx described is but a remnant of the definite social relation between men themselves, which assumes a fantastic form in a relationship between things. So in other words, Marx saw fetishized objects as representing connections between people, a critical point as Gioia locates manuscripts' magical value in their ability to link author to researcher through a physical object. So having that connection between the author and the researcher is what makes the object a fetish. So when you say, oh, I'm actually touching what Joyce Carol Oates touched, or what any other author touched, what James Joyce worked on, when you have that moment of excitement, when you have that dawning realization, you are having a moment in which a fetish is connecting you and the author, and that moment comes from the fetish itself. So embodiment can sometimes become literal rather than figurative. So what the fetish is doing is sometimes it's more figurative than literal. And Jacqueline Rose calls this literal embodiment the co-martial, apologize for my French. The body in bits and pieces is what it means. For example, Victorians used to exchange hair as a sign of attachment. Hair work, this practice of creating art, jewelry, and wreaths out of hair, would become popular until the mid-1920s. You might have had an opportunity to see this in a collection or even in an antique store. They still remain quite popular, and they're quite common to see. As a result, many archives and museums collected notable people's hair. However, Harry Ransom of the Harry Ransom Center now at the University of Texas at Austin derided this practice in 1956, saying, only morbid curiosity seems to justify the preservation anywhere, much less in Austin, Texas, of miscellaneous locks of hair from the heads of statesmen like Napoleon and poets like Shelley. He continued, those haircut museums will never, ever contribute to learning. When scholars admit to their interest in the bodies of authors by being excited that they're touching the same thing that their favorite author touched, they are acknowledging their own fetishization of literary manuscripts. They're saying, this manuscript is important because I can touch something that they touched. It's not the same as picking up a book they wrote that's in an edition that's more recent or more contemporary to me than it is to them. It's about having that physical contact with one another. And that's the moment of the fetish. So by conducting and research, they are engaging also in voyeurism, for they're taking pleasure in seeing these archival bodies. That's what makes the trip to see the archives special. That's what makes the difference between, say, something that's digitized and something that you can see and interact with in person. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but that's something to start the theoretical discussion. So, but by opening a knowledge to emotional connection to their subject of study, they are doing something that's discouraged and looked down upon. They are appearing to maintain, or at least appearing to maintain, a critical distance in order to guard against what Matthew Kirschenbaum calls vulgar author worship. So they need to make sure to reiterate their authorial stance as scholars as being separate from and not influenced by the emotions they feel when they engage with the papers. However, that emotion is what actually gives the papers their financial value in the first place, which then drives the entire archive market. So I know that this is a fast and loose introduction to the market forces that have really generated literary research in the past 50 years and are now kind of taking a turn at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, going forward. But I hope that this brings up in you some questions that we can now discuss. I'll end here. And so these, of course, you're not supposed to use gloves in the archive, but it represents the way in which touch is what's most important in the archive, and that the informational value is actually superseded by the experiential value. How American literary papers got into repositories is a long and complicated story, illustrated by all of these fine people, but it's one that begins with reinforcing the author's intellectual property, the creation of a profession to defend that property, and the evergreen allure of the body of the author. I welcome any questions you have, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Amy. As I noted in the chat, the Q&A function is available. So as questions come to mind, I encourage all of you to submit your questions there. Amy, I kind of wanted to just start, as is tradition or has been tradition at the FIBAC virtual book talks here. The first question often entails kind of the research or conception or process of the work. Could you give us a little background of how this project got started, and maybe how it developed over time?
Sure. So this process got started when I first learned that literary archives came from the authors to the repository. And that might sound a little strange. Of course, papers come from authors to a repository. But when I was working with curator Kevin Young at Emory's, what's now called the Rose Library, as a graduate student, under his tutelage, I was able to meet some authors who were thinking about placing their papers with Emory. And I was able to get a sense of both the author's perspective and the institution's perspective. And those perspectives were coexisting, but often at a slight conflict in terms of the amount that they would be willing to pay, the circumstances that they would permit. Often the authors were interested in slightly tighter privacy restrictions, or they wanted to personally approve research topics, which they didn't quite realize could become onerous over time, depending on the level of interest. And I just started to find the whole dance intriguing and kind of an emotional. It was sensitive, and I wanted to probe into that. And so when I worked on my dissertation, I thought about 3 different authors who placed their papers at Emory. But once I finished my PhD, I realized, of course, as a lot of people do, that the way I went about it for my dissertation was wrong, or was limited. It was extremely limited. And I thought, I need to have a data set. I need to think about not just how these different authors come to one institution. I need to think about how a set of writers comes to a set of institutions. I need to look at this on a more macro level to see what are the trends that these placements are showing. Does race, for example, make a difference? Does gender make a difference? Who has the largest sizes of papers? What institutions are the most prominent, and why? And only a data set would answer that. So I chose a control, which was the Norton Anthology of American Literature, and I looked at those authors as the most canonical, and we can talk about that, but basically because it's a teaching anthology. And then I created a data set where I asked a series of questions encoded in binary. And then I made tables off of that, and then I looked to see patterns and exceptions. And then I did additional qualitative research into the patterns or exceptions that I found quantitatively. And that's what wrote the book.
So here's just a follow-up, because there's a lot of, when you mentioned the tables and the data, it's very objective-based research here. And at the same time, I'm really excited and interested in this theoretical track that you bring as well, with in regards to how scholars in many cases act as voyeurs, fetishizing both author or selected materials. So I was kind of wondering how you kind of navigated that, because there's a certain level of excitement when you go to those archives for many of us. You mentioned the Matt Kirschenbaum line there, right? How do we create? What is your strategy, I guess, for creating a critical distance, which from which we can escape that author worship or that celebrity culture? And what are the benefits of kind of that magical experience too? It's not just all problematic.
No, absolutely not. I mean, and that's one of the things about like a kind of a short little talk on this, is that I absolutely believe it's not actually a problem. I think it's a problem of taste. As scholars, we are inclined to show ourselves as objective, and it gives us a little bit more credibility. If I can say I created a data set and I looked at these patterns, and then therefore we can see that X repository is the most important, you believe me more because, or at least a lot of scholars who are trained in more quantitative perspectives, you kind of give me a little bit more credence for that. But when you say like, I just really love this author, which frankly is kind of what I did for my dissertation, that just doesn't have the same bite to it. But I think underneath it all, we study what we study because we love it. And so it's just an amount of how many lenses do we put between our love and our interest in a subject and what we actually say about that subject. And a lot of really highly professionalized scholars are trained to put those lenses in front of us so that it's not as apparent what's happening. And I actually think that we can never become fully objective. I mean, that's just like if you work in the libraries, the pushback against libraries is objective. Libraries are never objective. Curators, what I would curate is different than what you would curate because our interests are different, and how people might approach us is different. And so therefore the results of what might come into our respective repositories could be different just because you and I are distinct individuals. So I don't think that there's ever really an objectivity. That's where my qualitative heart comes out. I just think we need to be rigorous in assessing where qualitative perspectives influence quantitative ones and vice versa. And the humanities doesn't tend to have as much of a quantitative perspective. But that's why I go in my book into this like long song and dance about like why I picked the Norton anthology, even though like, anthologies are racist and sexist and all like elitist and all sorts of bad things. But like at the end of the day, I just needed a data set. So I think that it's not that you should reject the fetishistic perspective or you should reject the idea that you are a voyeur. I think in a way, as a scholar, you need to embrace it and understand that you are participating in this type of economy, which foregrounds physical contact. Because if you accept that that is what is giving these papers value, you are actually led to a more important question, which is like, how do we do this when everything becomes digital and born digital collections are the primary literary archive? So to me, that's actually not the question that's interesting. The question that's interesting is like, well, what happens when we move that kind of fetish into a digital space? And do we lose it entirely or does it become something else?
I'm sure that last line is going to have many questions to follow in a moment.
It haunts us all.
Gosh. I would love to continue. I'm looking at the Q&A here. We have lots of questions, so I'd like to get others involved here. Sadly, now you got my.
I'm always on Twitter.
You got me going. So the first question here is: how are the practices of early literary agents related to the practices of other kinds of agents? For example, theatrical agents, lecture agents. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes down to intellectual property rights. Like I haven't, of course, studied theatrical agents. I haven't studied the lecture circuit. I mean, I certainly know a bit about those movements just from my general background knowledge, but to go in depth, of course, I don't have that particular answer ready for you. But what I would say is it is about getting money to the person who is creating that content. So if you think of like kind of our current parlance, like the content creator on YouTube or something like that, they're trying to go an alternative route because they want to be able to capture the money themselves and not go through a third party that would take a chunk off the top. And so this is something that keeps coming back. We keep wanting to benefit from our own work, right? And so the main issue with literary agents is that they offered a double-sided deal. Like on the one hand, yes, they're a middleman, and so it would cost authors less if they could simply represent themselves, but realistically, authors did not have that skill set and didn't have that legal knowledge, and everything was emerging. And so literary agents, I'm sure like the agents of other kind of arts and cultural endeavors, they thought, well, it's better for the author to make more money against the publishers and give a little bit to me on the side to represent them than to lose out majorly against a really, really strong publishing arm. So it's a balance of power situation, which I'm sure parallels itself no matter the venue.
Great. Yeah. Here's another question here that kind of relates back to the previous comment you ended on related to digital collections. Mm-hmm. If touch determines the value of archival papers, how does this affect the market value for digitized collections?
We're all trying to find that out. To me, I think there is a substitute for touch. The problem is it's not an easy one, and that's emulation. And this isn't coming from anyone. I'm not an appraiser. But what I would say is, to me, what's interesting that replicates somewhat that idea is the ability to see what makes an individual's workspace distinct from another. So for example, if I'm the author, you can see like, well, what programs do I use? What side applications do I use? Do I tend to intersperse my activity with certain searches on the internet? So all of that, you could actually have a really rich, even richer, dynamic environment if you can emulate the environment, but emulating it to that level of detail is simply beyond the resources of most institutions. And even the few institutions which have done it, like Emory, did it to a very limited extent. And no one has, or I should say very few people have really taken advantage of the critical insights that could provide. And so I think it's going to be really difficult. And I think, unfortunately, COVID-19 happened after I wrote my book. The long-term implications on the future of higher education will really shape what kinds of questions will be asked, and thus what cultural heritage repositories are asked to provide. And emulation is just such a bespoke, demanding service that I think it won't probably be rolled out except in the most exceptional of circumstances, and only if scholars really take it to heart and do interesting work with it. And I think those who are working in, say, like video game studies or those types of new media would be a good place to turn to for how we would theorize this type of turn to a digital collection. But I don't think there's an easy answer for now, especially with such a fraught fiscal environment. Sorry to be a downer.
We'll shift away from the digital then, and okay. We'll actually look at this next question, which talks about geography and physical space. So yeah, okay. What are some of the difficulties that arise when an author's archive is split between two different countries, for example, the UK and the US?
Oh my gosh, so many problems. Well, I mean, the first question I ask is not even what are the problems that are created when they're split, but why was it split? And sometimes I've thought about maybe having my next book be about this phenomenon, because of course I kind of was raised up at Emory, where Emory made most of its literary acquisitions early on from the UK and Ireland. And that there was a lot of pushback from Irish authors about why would you take the literary heritage of our country, which we are very proud of, and put it in another country. And I really think it is a new type of cultural colonization. I'm not super eloquent. You're hitting me like right after lunch. But it's the way in which the market forces go. Ultimately, writers need to make money, right? Authorship for except for the very rare few, doesn't necessarily make a ton of money. And so they need to be able to support themselves. And so they are going to be motivated to go wherever pays the most. And so where pays the most is usually the United States. But that's a problem when you start bringing cultural heritage across national lines and divorcing it from where it was previously. However, you could push back and say, but that's in the author's best interest, and that is what they choose to do. And it is paternalistic to say otherwise. So I think there's really good arguments on both sides as to the problems of doing that in the first place. But then to move on to the original question, it poses a huge issue for scholars. I know a lot of British scholars are having to fly to the US. Usually it's not the other way around. And that totally limits the type of research that can happen because, of course, only certain types of students or faculty have the time and the money and the support to do that type of work. So it becomes an issue of equity on the part of those who might be most invested in that particular scholar. But then it's also, is it about the equity of the scholars and their access to resources? Is that to be weighed higher than the right of the author to gain financial remuneration for their own work, you know? And so even though I'm a scholar myself, I personally tend to fall a little bit on the side of the authors. And that also comes up even in questions with like when things are split between, say, HBCUs and majority white institutions, or split across coasts in the United States, or even among regional institutions. However, most repositories do not encourage this anymore. It's not really considered the most ethical practice, and most repositories will encourage, once you start depositing your papers at one place, for you to keep them there, and won't compete against their sister institution because they realize they create such a problem.
Great. Here is a slightly different track question. What effect did the very American new criticism have on stalling affective attachment to American authors?
Well, now, it did push it back a bit. I mean, I think that we had, the funny thing, which is also a really good topic for a book, and I'm really about encouraging other people to do research because there's a lot of work here that I can't do myself, but that there's this weird disconnect between the library archives profession and the scholars. And so the library archives thinks that, and to some extent, they still think that, you know, we'll acquire stuff and then the scholars will use it. That they come first and then the scholars come second. And scholars tend to think they come first, they demonstrate interest, and then the library will acquire it. But it's really more interdependent than that. And so when scholars in general turned against looking at literary archives, like with new criticism, that didn't mean that they stopped being acquired. It might have slowed it down a little bit, and I haven't done the research to prove that, although you can see it somewhat historically. But I would actually say the theory wave might be a really interesting point to look at, because what's weird in the theory era is that in the 80s and 90s, mostly 90s, that's like the high point of literary collection acquisition, even though that's when they weren't being used as much. So the timeline of mapping scholarship demand to acquisition isn't as tightly knit as you would imagine. So that's my best answer for you. And that also, by the way, that also really annoyed the librarians and archivists who would do all this work and then would see their scholars not using it at all. It really, there were some really sad comments from like the Yale librarians who really built astounding holdings that their faculty never really used it, kind of in the mid-20th century and like the 70s and so. And so it's really heartbreaking that they're not always in step with each other.
Mm-hmm. We've got a time for a couple more. I'm noticing the Q&A queue here is filling up pretty nicely, so I apologize. We might not get to all of these today, but I will forward these emails to Amy. So.
Oh well, yeah, and I'm always happy to answer, or I can tweet it out too. So please don't feel like if I don't get to your questions, I won't answer it.
So I'm just going down the list. I'm not picking favorites. So you know. The next question. Let's see, where did I leave off? Okay. Well, It keeps moving as folks keep adding. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the connection between the development of literary archive practices in American colleges and universities and the boom of creative writing programs in the same environment.
Isn't it interesting? I'll say that I used to joke that a good side hustle for me would be to trot around all the MFA programs and teach them how to archive their materials, or to preserve their materials, and they should preserve them because they would sell for a lot of money later. And I would just reap the bucks on that. I did give a talk actually at the Iowa Writers Workshop a few years ago, telling them that this is something to consider, that they should think about retaining their computers and their notebooks for the future, because every MFA student thinks they're going to be a rock star, right? So I do think that they go hand in hand. There was a cultural influx, or a financial influx to support the creative arts in the later half of the 20th century, whether that was through MFA programs or supporting the development of English departments, funding the research ability or the sort of acquisition ability of libraries to support researchers. So the money was flush, and the interest was there. And furthermore, what's really interesting about, say, places like the Ransom Center and the Iowa Writers Workshop is that they were partially created to showcase the value of American capitalism and democracy against alternative government options. So the idea that this is where free writing and free thinking is valued and encouraged, and this is why people usually of Soviet satellite states, this is why you should choose to follow a more American version of government and foreign policy than you should follow the Soviet option. So the nation building and creative writing and higher education and research libraries are really intertwined, and it's important because we might have military might, but there's also a thing known as soft power, and so this is soft power. And it's even soft power when you can say, reach into the labs of your cousin or sibling countries like the UK and say, I'll take a little bit of that. I'll take your Seamus Heaney, thank you. There's something to be said about what that shows as power, that you can bring the stars of other countries to your home. But ultimately, it's a way to showcase that creativity and the arts and culture are supported in a free society, which is a capitalistic society. And there's a lot to be said there. But yes, it's absolutely intertwined.
Thank you. There's a lot more to be said about that as well. My goodness. Maybe one more question here, still going down the list here. In your experience, how does the book trade auction world influence how archives acquire materials?
So I will start by saying I have never worked as a curator myself. I have worked under a curator for a number of years and at three different special collections, Emory, Alabama, and Iowa. So I want to make sure that I am foregrounding myself as more of a scholar at this moment than as someone who's worked directly with the rare book and archives trade. I think that the way in which they interact is that they're looking to make a good pairing, right? So the literary agent, the rare book dealer, they're seeking to make the most amount of money they can for themselves and their clients. At the same time, they don't want to go past the point where repositories can't pay. So it's a very difficult balance. For example, in my book, I talk about Allen Ginsberg, whose collection is giant. It's the largest collection out of all the ones in my data set. And it was appraised at a very high price, but it was appraised at a price that was so high that no one could pay it. And actually the repository where it was originally housed, Columbia couldn't pay it, and so they moved it to Stanford, which is interesting because Ginsberg had no connection to Stanford. And so that shows that money matters more, which I found particularly interesting. But the issue is that you have to make sure that it's in balance, right? And so like right now, I know that the rare book and manuscript dealers are turning more towards private collectors because the price tolerance at universities and cultural repositories is a bit lower. And I think that might be something that continues. So those interactions are really driven by a market that is both within the literary archives market itself and then the rare books market and kind of cultural heritage and art sector more broadly. But then even further out, because for example, like the buying power of the Ransom Center is really driven by the oil market. So once you start dialing it into the commodities that power these particular universities, you can see that whether or not a particular university has a Shakespeare folio or a certain literary collection is really driven by where they're getting their money, and where they're getting their money is often tied to kind of wider economic circumstances, which also is something to really look into. So I think of it as like the sin universities, like oil, tobacco, things like that, alcohol. That's a great research topic for someone.
These nuggets that come out. By the way, I just wanted to add here that you received several LOLs about the MFA Rockstar comment. But
Everyone.
having been through an MFA program myself, I was horrified. I wanted you to know, because for years I have been justifying my hoarding on the premise that I would be selling, I would be, upon my passing, someone would be making money off of these dirty napkins. But
you just need to write a blockbuster book.
That's right.
It's all, yeah. I think for me, it's actually
poking holes through that. I hope none of my friends and family are watching.
Well, hey, I stopped hoarding my own stuff because I realized like I will never be that important. So but then again, it's really important, and the charm is in the sticky notes and the napkins. So I don't know, you guys.
Well, we got them.
Okay.
One final question. I know you've spoken a lot about this in the past. That is your status as independent scholar. With COVID-19 and so much in the world changing the last 6 months, do you have any advice that you could give those graduate students that are currently watching that will soon themselves have to kind of navigate various markets and try to find their own path through a much more complicated time? So your advice?
Yeah, well, first, please do not hesitate to reach out to me either through email or Twitter. I have been through the path that you are on. I am currently on that path, and I always welcome hearing from folks. I'm happy to chat with you one-on-one or just exchange messages, whatever you feel most comfortable with, because I know it can be really difficult financially and emotionally, as well as professionally, to sort of to understand what's next for you, and even to cope with the emotions brought up with our current climate. So please reach out, because that's the best way to sort of get the ball rolling. But my specific advice, other than reaching out to me and other folks, hopefully that you feel comfortable with, that have kind of gone this way before you, is to accept that change is inevitable. So I personally listen to like a lot of Buddhist podcasts, and maybe that's a bit oversharing for this kind of talk, but them's the times. But it's important to realize that change is always happening. Nothing is stable. The American Literary Archives market was really, I'm starting to think, like this moment of a couple of decades in the late 20th century that heated up. And that what it looks like 20 years from now is going to be really different and not really at all like what came before. Feel free to prove me wrong in the future. But if you accept that change is inevitable, you start from a better, ironically, a more solid basis for capturing what's coming next, because you can think about the alternatives rather than being sort of still angry that you're not on that straight path. And so you have to mourn that loss, but if you don't accept that change will have to happen, you're going to be stuck in a loop where you can be exploited, as adjuncts or lower paid laborers in one way or another. So for example, I now work full time as a scientific editor and project manager for antibiotic. They develop antibiotics and antifungals. I've been in that role since January, and it's an excellent place. So I am doing the things I love. I love working with words, and I'm contributing to scientific research that's helping global health, which has nothing at all to do with what I was trained to do and what I originally loved to do, which is this. But you know what? It pays the bills. I work with great people. And I'm still working with scholars. They're just different types of scholars. So if you embrace that you can live a life that can be financially rewarding and intellectually interesting, but that life might look a little different, you'll be well on your way to getting there. So I guess my advice is first, reach out. Second, allow yourself to mourn. And third, embrace change. Because that shows that change is inevitable and that it's not a particular failure on your part. I would argue maybe it's a failure of our society, but even then, things come and things go. And your ability to be successful will be based on your ability to accept and welcome shifts. And then if you want to know how to do that and need more personal guidance, please, like I said, reach out.
Oh, thank you, Amy. And I can vouch for Amy. She's the nicest person.
No, and I also forgot, I hope you take my book as an example of, you do not have to have a tenure track job to produce an academic book. I wrote mine on nights and weekends and during holidays when working as an academic librarian, okay? So you can do whatever you want, but you have to devote the time and energy and effort, and those are hard trade-offs. But if it's what you want, it's what you want. So don't ever believe that just because you don't have X position, you can't do Y.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's my last.
Typically at this time, I'd like to wrap things up. I like to say thanks and goodbye. I ask everybody to hang out for just one more moment because we have a special treat. Amy has donated a signed copy of her book for a free giveaway, as we've advertised on social media, for everybody who has registered to the event. All of the names were added into an online randomizer, and I am happy to say that the winner is Angela Ray. You are the winner of the giveaway. I will email you later today for your mailing address so that we could send you the prize. So congratulations, Angela. We'll be in touch soon. And with that, thank you. I'd like to thank our guest, Amy Hildreth Chen, for joining us today. Remember that her Placing Papers is available for order. You can go to the University of Massachusetts Press, among other places. Amy, thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you, everyone, for coming this afternoon. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. And I look forward to answering your questions. So thanks for sending them over, Kevin.
I absolutely will. Thanks to everybody for attending today. If you are interested in our next talk, you again are welcome to sign up for our mailing address. I will also be sending an email out to everyone who attended today to remind you of the upcoming schedule. Our next talk is September 25th. It features Jessica Pressman from San Diego State University, who will be talking about her forthcoming book, Bookishness. So please remember to check out future AAS programs, to sign up for the mailing address. And thanks, everybody. I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.